The bid closed at 400 credits, and I was the only one left in the room. That should have told me everything I needed to know. I had been running salvage auctions for 11 years. I had bought broken freighters, stripped mining rigs, decommissioned escort ships with holes in their hulls large enough to walk through sideways. I had once bought an entire orbital platform from a Drenai salvage company for less than the cost of a mid-range atmospheric skiff, and I had made a reasonable profit on it because I had known what I was looking at, and the Drenai hadn't. I knew this business. I knew the rhythms of it. And one of the most fundamental rhythms of auction work was that there was always someone else bidding. There was always at least one other person who wanted the scrap value alone, who had done the basic arithmetic on hull material and drive components, and copper-equivalent cabling, and decided that even a completely dead ship had something worth taking. But on that morning, in the Korath Station auction hall, every single alien bidder dropped out the moment Lot 7 appeared on the projection screen. I watched them go one by one, and I want to be clear about what that looked like, because it was not what you might imagine. It was not dramatic. Nobody shouted or made a scene. Nobody pointed at the screen and said something ominous. They simply looked at the projection when it loaded, each of them in turn as the display resolved into a clear image, and then they left. The Vrelian trader to my left folded his bidding panel with careful precision, and stood without looking at anyone, and stepped past the two empty seats beside him, and walked out through the side door without a word. The two Osek merchants near the back of the hall exchanged a look I could not read from where I sat, a look that carried information between them faster than language, and then they walked out together. Not quickly, not in a way that could be called a run, but with the steady, purposeful pace of beings who have made a firm decision and are acting on it. The Drenai representative, who had been the most active bidder in the room all morning, who had secured 3 lots at competitive prices and had shown no sign of slowing down, sat very still for 3 full seconds after the Lot 7 image appeared on the screen. He placed his bidding panel face down on the seat beside him. He stood. He left. He did not take the panel with him. He did not take the panel. I noticed that detail. In 11 years of salvage work, I had seen bidders forget things in the heat of the moment, but I had never seen anyone leave their equipment behind in a calm, empty hall with plenty of time to collect it. You left your panel behind when you were moving faster than your hands. The hall, which had held 42 registered bidders at the opening of the morning block, now held 1. The projection on the screen showed Lot 7, a Varric-class Dominion cruiser, roughly 800 meters from bow to stern, fair to poor structural condition, according to the catalog notation. The image was not particularly frightening to look at. The ship was intact, its main hull showing no breach, its running lights dim but present on the port side, and out entirely on the starboard. A few scoring marks along the starboard flank, the kind you got from a tethering cable under tension. One antenna array bent at an odd angle. It looked like any mid-sized warship that had seen decades of hard use and then been parked somewhere and forgotten. There was nothing about the image itself that should have cleared a room, which meant the room had not been cleared by the image. The auctioneer, a Pilari named something I had long since given up attempting to pronounce correctly, cleared his throat twice, and looked at me with an expression I had learned to read across the species divide as discomfort. He was a professional, the kind of professional who had been doing this work for longer than I had been alive by most estimates, and he did not get rattled easily. But he was rattled now, and he was trying to hide it, and he was not entirely succeeding. He called the lot again. Standard procedure required 3 calls before closing or withdrawing. The hall stayed silent. 41 empty chairs, and the hum of the station's environmental systems, and the projection on the screen that had emptied all of them. On the second call, he looked at me directly and I held his gaze, and the look that passed between us was the kind that happens when one person has information they are not permitted to share and wishes the situation were different. On the third call, I raised my bidding panel and entered 400 credits. Not because I was brave, not because I had assessed the risk and found it acceptable. I entered the bid because I had spent 11 years learning that the most valuable thing in any salvage transaction was the thing that nobody else wanted to touch, and the question you always needed to answer was whether they didn't want it because it was worthless, or because they knew something you didn't. Either way, finding out what that thing was had always been worth more to me than playing it safe. And 400 credits for 800 meters of Varric military construction was not a number that occurred in honest commerce. Someone wanted this ship to disappear quickly and cheaply, and I wanted to know why. The auctioneer closed the lot. He printed my purchase certificate without making eye contact, keeping his gaze fixed slightly to the left of the printer throughout, looking at a point on the counter surface that had nothing on it. When I leaned across to take the certificate, he said one thing in a low voice, barely above a murmur, spoken quickly as though he wanted it out of his mouth and gone. He said, "The manifest is incomplete." I said, "I know. The catalog listed the manifest sections as pending." He said, "You don't understand. The manifest is incomplete on purpose." He turned and walked into the back office, and the door sealed behind him, and I stood at the counter for 30 seconds, waiting to see if he would return, and he did not. I folded the certificate and put it in the inner pocket of my coat. The transit corridor from the auction hall to Bay 14 was 11 minutes of lower-level station walkway, coolant smell and recycled air, and the faint vibration of the docking machinery running somewhere behind the walls. I walked slowly, thinking about each piece of what had just happened and how they fit together. The Drenai's panel left on the seat. The auctioneer's voice when he said the word purpose. The way every alien bidder in that room had known, from the moment the image appeared, something that I did not yet know. My ship, the Wren, was a 42-meter light cargo hauler that had kept me alive for 11 years, through work that was not always clean or simple. She was not beautiful. She was reliable, which in my experience was worth more than beautiful in almost every situation that mattered. I sat in her pilot chair and pulled the Lot 7 catalog entry up on the main display and read through it again slowly. Image, measurements, designation, former Varick Dominion military vessel, decommissioned, condition, fair to poor structural condition, system status variable, and 2 lines that I had noted at the auction and now read 3 times each. Life support systems, active. Manifest, cargo classification pending. Active life support on a decommissioned ship at salvage auction. Ships entered into salvage were powered down. Running life support cost operational credits and added complexity to the sale and wore on the systems. You did not run life support on a ship you were trying to sell unless you had a reason you could not get around. Either the Varick Dominion had been careless in decommissioning this vessel, or life support could not be turned off. I sat with that thought. Then I contacted the docking registry, confirmed my ownership certificate, and got the external anchor coordinates. The ship was 3 kilometers off the station's south face. I filed a transit tube request, paid the docking fee, and sat in the pilot chair for the 45 minutes it took the station to process the paperwork. Claire Ogden called twice during the wait. Claire ran the financial and administrative side of our business from Vega Station, 12 days away by standard transit. She had access to the same auction feeds I did, and she had clearly seen the Lot 7 transaction go through the moment it processed. The first call was careful and professional, and asked what my reasoning was, in the tone she used when she was trying very hard not to say what she actually wanted to say. The second call came 8 minutes later, and was neither careful nor professional, and contained several specific questions about my judgment that I thought were reasonable to ask under the circumstances. I answered the second call. I said, "The ship is running active life support. The manifest was deliberately left incomplete. Every alien bidder in the room walked out the second the lot appeared on screen." She said, "That is not a reassuring explanation." I said, "It cost 400 credits." She said, "Marcus." I said, "I'll call you when I know something." She was still talking when the transit assignment processed, and I stood up from the chair. The transit pod carried me out through the south access channel, and I got my first close look at the cruiser through the forward window as we approached. It was bigger than any image made it look. Military vessels always were. The hull was dark gray, the color of old stone in low light, with the flat planes and hard angles, and complete indifference to appearance, that Varick engineers had always preferred. Every surface served a function, and nothing was there that didn't. The scoring marks along the starboard side were long and parallel, tethering marks, the result of a heavy cable under high load. Someone had dragged this ship into position without being gentle about it. The transit pod docked at the main boarding collar, the seal pressurized. I sat with my hand on the hatch release. I pulled it. The air that came through was cold and flat, and carried the metallic undertone of recycling systems that had been running without proper maintenance for a long time. But it was breathable. More than breathable. The oxygen concentration, the humidity, the temperature, all of it was calibrated within the range a human body found comfortable. Not Varric standard, not calibrated for any of the species I regularly worked with. Human calibration. I stepped aboard. The hatch sealed behind me. The corridor lights ran on emergency setting, a dim blue-white glow every 10 meters, enough to navigate by. The floor was clean in the specific way that sealed spaces become clean when nothing has moved in them for years. A thin, settled residue across the deck with no footprints in it. The walls carried the oxidation pattern of long-duration, low-activity operation. I walked forward through the ship's standard layout and checked each junction. At the central lift, I went down 2 levels. When the doors opened, I was looking at a corridor that was not on any public schematic of a Varric-class vessel I had ever reviewed. The door at the far end was different from the surrounding construction. Different material, slightly warmer in color, with a locking mechanism that did not match the Varric design language. The frame where it met the surrounding wall was not clean. You could see the join, the slight mismatch in material and color where one had been fitted against the other. It had been added after the ship was built, and it had been added by people who were working quickly. Above the door, stenciled in plain characters that had faded but remained fully readable, was a designation in 3 languages. In mine it read, Biological Containment, Class 4. I stood in that blue-white corridor and looked at that sign, and listened to the life support hum, and said out loud to nobody at all, "What did you people do?" It was not quite a question. I did not touch the door. Not that day. I went back to the Wren, ate a meal I did not taste, and slept badly in the crew bunk. In the morning I made coffee and sat at the main display, and did what I should have done at the auction. I pulled every public record I could access on Varric Dominion decommissioned military vessels. I ran the hull number from the cruiser's port bow through 3 separate databases, 2 requiring paid access. Nothing useful came back from any of them. The ship did not appear in any public decommissioning record. It had not been listed as retired, transferred, stripped, or scrapped. According to the Galactic Trade Registry, the vessel with that hull number did not exist. I was looking at it from 30 meters away. My contact at the registry was a man named Oliver Price, who handled documentation disputes and owed me a favor from a customs hold issue 2 years earlier. Oliver worked long hours and answered calls at strange times, both of which made him genuinely useful in my line of work. He answered on the 3rd ring. I sent him the hull number. He looked at it and was quiet for a stretch that told me, before he said anything, that the number meant something to him. He said, "Where did you get this?" I said, "I bought the ship." He said my name slowly. He said, "This hull number is flagged in the secondary archive, not just filed as inactive. Flagged, with a status marker from the Varric diplomatic office. The status reads internal resolution pending. It has held that status for 41 years. I said, "What does that designation mean in standard practice?" He said, "In my experience, it means something happened that the relevant parties did not want to document properly, and they have been waiting to see if the problem reduces on its own." I thanked him and ended the call. 41 years. A diplomatic flag. Internal resolution pending. Something nobody had wanted to write down correctly. Life support running on an officially non-existent ship. Every bidder in a competitive auction room clearing out without explanation. I went back to the cruiser, and this time I came prepared. Full diagnostic kit. Emergency medical supplies. A full kit rather than a basic one. Portable atmosphere analyzer with a through-door probe attachment. My Varric cipher tool. A long cable linked to the Wren's communication system, because I was not going to trust the cruiser's internal network, and I wanted to be able to reach Claire if I needed to without depending on anything on that ship. I boarded through the same collar and went directly to the lower corridor. The containment door was exactly as I had left it. I set up the atmosphere analyzer and ran the probe against the door material. 4 minutes for the reading to return. I looked at the result. Oxygen inside the sealed area, 21%, stable. Temperature, 19 degrees. Humidity, 45%. Carbon dioxide, elevated but within tolerable range. The elevated level consistent with biological systems in a very slow metabolic state operating over an extended period. living things. Behind that door. Not formerly alive. Not alive in a recent past. Currently alive right now. At the moment I was reading the numbers. Slow metabolic state meant they were not moving. Not awake. But the life support was not maintaining an empty room. It was maintaining an environment for something that was still inside it. And that something required oxygen at 21% and was comfortable at 19 degrees. I studied the locking mechanism carefully. Varick military hardware, heavy and well made, but the installation was rough. The bolt housings were not evenly seated. One had a hairline crack sealed with quickset compound, instead of a proper repair weld. The frame seams showed the same rushed quality I had noticed from the corridor side. Someone had installed this containment system in a hurry, without the right tools, under pressure that did not allow for careful work. The access panel used a standard Varick cipher. My tool worked through the codes in 11 minutes. The panel lit green. The lock retracted, with a sound like a long breath being let go, a deep mechanical exhale. I pushed the door open. The room beyond was large. It occupied the full volume of what should have been a secondary operations bay, roughly 30 meters across and 20 deep, with a high ceiling. The emergency lighting was supplemented here by amber guide strips along the floor, the kind used in medical facilities to allow staff to move without disrupting patients. The amber strips ran in parallel rows from the door toward the far wall, and along each row, arranged with exact and deliberate precision, were cryogenic suspension pods. I counted from the doorway. 17 pods. All sealed. All active. Each one showing the soft green pulse of an occupied and stable unit. Each pod had a small status display on its face, and from where I stood, every display was lit. I walked to the nearest one. The display showed vital signs. Heartbeat, slow, strong, regular. Respiration, very low but consistent. Core temperature, in the range typical of deep suspension protocol. And in the upper corner of the display, in small plain text that the Varick technicians had apparently not considered worth removing, was a name. Colin Marsh. I moved to the next pod. Same display format, same stable readings. The name in the corner read, Diane Weller. I walked the entire row and read every name. Colin Marsh, Diane Weller, Patrick Okafor, Grace Finch, Neil Avery, Laura Stoke, Owen Burrell, Sandra Hale, Edmund Cross, Petra Dale, Connor Webb, Francis Abbott, Gordon Reese, Sylvia Grant, Alan Toft, Ruth Kane, Victor Lowe, 17 names, all of them human. I stood in that room for a long time and did not move, and the life support hummed around me steady and patient, and I thought about the auctioneer's face, and the Drenai bidders panel, sitting face down on an empty chair, and the 4 decades of an unresolved diplomatic flag. And I said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. Then I pulled out the portable terminal and accessed the data core through the same cipher channel that had opened the containment door. I was looking for intake records, administrative files, whatever had been created when these people were first brought aboard. The relevant files were buried deep in a subdirectory labeled in a Varick dialect that needed the translation tool to parse. The folder title translated, as closely as the software could render it, holding notes, internal use only. I opened the oldest entry. It was dated 41 years ago. It read, 17 biological specimens recovered from disabled colony vessel, at coordinates on file. Specimens are identified as human origin. All 17 specimens are alive and in apparent good health. Specimens displayed no distress response upon initial contact or examination. Recommend extended observation before disposition is decided. I read the file again to make sure I had the translation right. Then I opened the next file, and the next, and the ones after that. I stood in that room with 17 living people sleeping around me, and I read for an hour and a half. The colony ship had been the Aldrin Point, registered out of New Bristol, 43 years prior. A settlement run, standard operation, 112 passengers and crew, bound for an outer system colony. The Varick Dominion had intercepted it in a region under disputed territorial claim. The Varick captain had ordered it stopped for inspection under the Dominion's border authority. The records documented this part carefully. The stop itself was legal, or defensible under the territorial law then in effect. During the inspection stop, the Aldrin point suffered a catastrophic drive failure, not from the Varric vessel, not from weapons fire or interference. The compression event had been internal, a failure mode in that generation of civilian drive systems, and it had been fast. The main hull came apart in sections. 95 people did not survive. 17 did. The Varric captain had pulled the 17 survivors from the debris field. The rescue was documented in clean, professional language. What was not documented anywhere was any external communication. No report to human authorities. No registration through the interspecies rescue protocol that had been law for 60 years. No record of the Aldrin point's fate transmitted to any outside party. The captain had recovered 17 human survivors and had told no one. At some subsequent point, the official Dominion navigation record for the Aldrin point's last known position had been altered. The ship was reported as lost with all hands, in a navigation sector 3 systems, from where the drive failure had actually occurred. Lost with all hands. The 17 people sleeping in the pods around me had been listed as dead for 41 years. The study notes were voluminous, 31 years of them, produced by a rotating series of Varric researchers who had been assigned to the holding vessel, each one continuing the program from where the previous had ended. The research had never involved reviving the subjects for direct interaction. All examination had been conducted through the pod systems. Physiological scans, biological samples drawn through the pod's medical access ports, long detailed papers on human biology and physiology and metabolic function during extended suspension. The kind of data that would have been scientifically significant if the circumstances of its collection had been anywhere in the records, which they were not. The researchers had been careful. The life support maintenance logs were meticulous. Pod condition checks had been run on a regular schedule for decades without significant gap. Whatever else the Varric program had been, the people running it had not been negligent about keeping the subjects alive. The research notes stopped 10 years ago. The final administrative entry, dated 10 years back, read in translation, "Research program concluded following reallocation of specialist personnel to priority projects. Disposition of biological subjects remains unresolved. Life support systems to remain active pending directive from diplomatic office. No directive has been received to date. Current status, holding. Awaiting resolution. 10 years of waiting for a directive." The directive had not come because issuing it required acknowledging what the original captain had done. The original captain had been a senior officer with a long and distinguished career in Varric Dominion service. Putting that career in front of a formal inquiry was a thing the Dominion had chosen, at every point where the choice had presented itself, not to do. So the years had accumulated, and the life support had run, and eventually the vessel had become a problem that needed a resolution that was not an inquiry. A maintenance commitment nobody wanted to authorize, a secret too expensive to keep properly, and too dangerous to handle carelessly. And someone in the Dominion's logistics administration, probably a junior officer who had inherited the file and needed it gone, had found the most efficient available solution: a salvage auction, an incomplete manifest, a price low enough to guarantee a quick sale, and the quiet trust that whoever bought the ship would not be the kind of person who opened sealed containment doors on former military vessels. The trust, specifically, that the buyer would not be human. I put the terminal away. I walked the row of pods one last time. 17 green lights. 17 people who did not know their ship was gone, who did not know that everyone else on it was dead, who did not know the galaxy had continued without them for 41 years, while a series of researchers wrote papers about their bone density. I went back to the Wren and sat in the pilot chair for a few minutes without doing anything. Then I called Claire. She answered on the first ring. I said, "I found something." She said, "What?" I said, 17 people. The silence on the line was long and complete. Then she said, one word, "Alive?" I said, "Yes." She did not say anything for a moment. When she did, her voice was quieter than it had been in either of the previous calls. She said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "Wake them up." The revival protocol built into the pod interface was detailed and well constructed. 6 hours of gradual warming per pod, followed by a chemical flush of the suspension medium, followed by a monitored awakening period with oxygen support, provided through the pod's internal systems. 1 pod at a time, The bay's support systems were not rated for simultaneous revival at full protocol standard. I spent the evening reading the protocol 3 full times to make sure I had every step. I checked the bay's power draw against the ship's available output. I inventoried the emergency medical supplies I had brought and matched them against the protocol's post-revival guidance. Sufficient. The bay also had its own medical cache along the east wall, stocked and within expiration tolerance. Whatever else could be said about the Varric research program, they had maintained the supply lines correctly. The first pod I chose was Colin Marsh, based on vital sign stability. I initiated his revival sequence the next station morning. Then I sat with my back against the bay wall 3 meters from his pod, and I waited. 6 hours is a long time to sit in a quiet room. I used part of it to run a full structural assessment of the cruiser with the diagnostic kit's remote package. The ship was in much better condition than the auction catalog had implied. The hull scoring was cosmetic. The drive systems were offline but undamaged, core compression chambers intact. The command deck was powered down but showed no hardware failure. The communications array was partially damaged at one cluster, but the primary array was functional. Someone had maintained this ship carefully for a long time. The quality of the upkeep did not falter until the final years of the program. I used another part of the time to copy the complete data core archive to 3 separate storage drives. 2 went into the Wren's emergency vault. The third went into my coat pocket. About 5.5 hours into the warming cycle, the pod's readings began to shift in earnest. Core temperature moving upward in steady small increments. Heartbeat strengthening with each passing minute, becoming more defined, losing the ghost-thin quality of deep suspension, and taking on the quality of something that was genuinely, actively happening. Respiration increasing from the barely there rhythm of the stasis state to something that looked like sleep. At 6 hours and 7 minutes, the pod seal hissed and opened. The man inside was in his mid-30s, which I held in my mind was 41 years out of date. He had dark hair and a short beard grown slowly during suspension, and the pale bluish skin that extended stasis left as a signature. He was breathing on his own, his eyes were closed. I moved to the side of the pod and waited, as the protocol instructed. His eyes opened 12 minutes later. Brown eyes. And the first and most striking thing about them was how present they were. Not the slow, confused surface of someone waking from heavy sleep. Not the gradual, uncertain return of someone who had lost track of where they were. These were the eyes of someone arriving back at full awareness in a short interval, complete and clear. He looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at me. He said, in a voice rough with disuse, but completely clear in its register, "You're human." I said, "Yes." He said, "Where are we?" I said, "About 3 kilometers off a station called Korath. Deep Transit Region, Sector 11. He processed that, comparing it against some internal geography. He said, "The Aldrin Point." It was not quite a question. I said, "Gone. I'm sorry. I'll explain everything. Would you like water first?" He looked at my face for a moment, reading it quickly and carefully. Then he said, "Yes. And then you explain." I gave him water. I let him sit up at his own pace. I kept my voice level, because the protocol advised against abrupt stimulus in the first 30 minutes, and because this man had woken from 41 years of imposed sleep to find a stranger beside him on an alien warship, and calm was the only reasonable approach regardless of any protocol. I told him everything: the auction, the 400 credits, the room of empty chairs, the auctioneer who had not looked at me, the manifest marked incomplete on purpose, the active life support, the containment door and the rough installation, and the lock that had not been fitted correctly, the atmosphere probe reading, the data core, the study notes, 41 years of internal records filed under holding notes, internal use only, in a folder buried where nobody would look for it, and everyone hoped nobody would. All of it, without softening any part of it, because I had learned in 11 years of salvage work that people who had been through something serious did not thank you for the softened version. They thanked you for the truth. It gave them something solid to work with. He listened without interrupting once. His face stayed quiet throughout. When I finished, he was still for about 30 seconds. Then he said, 41 years. I said, yes. He said, all 17 of us. I said, All 17 are stable. I started your pod first to confirm the revival process was working before running the others. He was quiet for another moment. Then he looked at the row of pods along the wall and looked at each one in turn, the green lights steady on every face panel. And then he looked back at me and said, "What are you going to do with the records?" I said, "That depends on what you want." He said, "What I want." He said it quietly, measuring the words. Then he said, "I want a record that exists outside their system and cannot be erased from it. And I want someone with actual authority to have to look at what happened here and say what it was, in a formal proceeding, out loud, on the record." I said, "I can work with that." He said, "Who are you?" I said, "Marcus Hale, salvage broker." He said, "You bought this ship for 400 credits." I said, "Yes." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but close to one. The expression of a man who has just understood something that, in any other context, he might have found funny. He said, "Best deal you ever made." I said, "Probably." He swung his legs over the edge of the pod and placed his feet on the deck and sat with the steadiness of someone getting used to gravity after a long time without it. Then he straightened and looked at the row of pods and said, in a voice already firmer than it had been 10 minutes ago, "Start the next one." I started the next one. Over the following 2 days, I ran the revival protocol on all 17 pods, one at a time, at 6-hour intervals, and watched each person come back in their own way. Each awakening had its own pace and its own character. Grace Finch came up fast, eyes open and focused within 10 minutes of her seal releasing, and her first question was about the ship's legal status, and her second was about the data core, and she had clearly been thinking before her eyes were fully open. A man named Alan Toft, who the intake records listed as a medic on the Aldrin Point, took nearly 40 minutes to fully surface, and spent the first part of that time speaking quietly to himself, in what I recognized after a few minutes as a personal orienting exercise, working through something internally at his own pace before he engaged with anything external. I did not interrupt him. A young woman named Ruth Kane had been 22 at the time of capture. The intake records showed her listed as a student passenger, and she sat on the edge of her open pod for a long time without speaking, and I brought her water and a thermal blanket, and sat a few feet away and said nothing, until she looked up and indicated she was ready. What struck me across all 17 revivals was this: not one of them was passive about it. Each person, as the disorientation of long suspension cleared, began doing something. Colin organized the group as each new person woke, going through the essential facts in the direct, unsoftened way I had used with him, so that I did not have to repeat the full account 17 times. Grace Finch asked for access to the data core within an hour of waking, and when I showed her how to reach it through the cipher access I had already opened, she sat down at the interface and began working through the archive with the focused, methodical attention of someone who has decided what they are doing and is doing it. Owen Burrell, who had been the Aldrin Point's chief engineer, walked out of the revival bay 4 hours after waking up and conducted a complete inspection of the cruiser's drive systems on his own initiative, without anyone asking him to, and came back with a handwritten condition assessment that was more accurate and more thorough than anything my diagnostic kit had produced in a fraction of the time. Gordon Reese, the Aldrin Point's senior navigation officer, went directly to the command deck once he was physically stable, and spent several hours reviewing the navigation systems and producing an analysis of the ship's transit capability that was ready before I had finished the remaining revivals. Sandra Hale, no relation to me despite the name, had been the Aldrin Point's communications officer. Within 6 hours of waking, she had repaired the damaged antenna cluster on the cruiser's secondary array, using parts she had located in the ship's maintenance stores, without asking anyone where they were kept. Victor Lowe, who the intake records listed as a geologist, spent his first full day of wakefulness reading through the Varick research files systematically and producing a structured summary document that cross-referenced the study notes against the maintenance logs and administrative entries in a way that made the full sequence of events easier to follow than anything I had assembled. None of them waited to be told what to do. None of them waited until they felt fully ready before they started. They assessed what was available to them. They identified what was useful, and they began. The Varick research notes had flagged this behavior repeatedly across 31 years of observation, in language that expressed consistent confusion about what it signified. One researcher had written that the subjects displayed persistent investigation behavior under all monitored parameters and conditions. Another had described, in careful language that nonetheless communicated genuine puzzlement, an absence of what they called recognized containment response, noting that even under circumstances that should have produced passivity, the subjects continued exploratory and organizational activity across all observable channels. A third researcher, in one of the later entries, had written simply and without additional commentary that this species does not appear to recognize containment as a natural state. Reading those entries while standing in the room with 17 living examples of the behavior being described, I understood something that I suspected the Varick Dominion had never fully worked out. It was not the ship that had cleared the auction room. It was what every alien bidder in that room had understood was inside it. On the morning of the third day, with all 17 people awake and moving through the ship, with Alan Toft doing medical rounds and Owen running final calibrations on the drive systems and Gordon working from the command deck, I sat down with Colin and Grace and Gordon in the common area to talk through what came next. Gordon's assessment of the navigation systems was ready and clear. The cruiser was fully capable of inter-system transit once the drives completed calibration. Owen had put the drive restoration estimate at 3 to 4 hours of final work. The food stores were old but within tolerance. The medical supplies were adequate. The ship had what 17 people needed to sustain themselves through a journey of reasonable duration. Grace put her work on the table between us. She had spent the previous 2 days, in between helping with revivals and learning the ship's layout, reading through the complete data core archive with a thoroughness that impressed me, and produced something I could not have matched working alone. She had reconstructed the full chain of administrative decisions that led from the original captain's suppression of the rescue record to the logistics administrator who had listed the ship for auction. Every step documented, every step cross-referenced against file dates, personnel records from the archive, maintenance logs that placed specific individuals aboard the vessel at specific points, a complete and verifiable sequence from the first deliberate omission 41 years ago to the 400-credit auction lot at Korath Station. She put it on the table and said, "This goes to the Trade Council." Gordon said, "The Varick Diplomatic Office will challenge the jurisdiction immediately. They'll argue the Council's commercial division doesn't have authority over internal Dominion military decisions." Grace said, "Let them make that argument. Everything in this documentation is from their own archive, produced by their own researchers, filed in their own administrative system. To challenge the content of these records, they have to challenge the records themselves, which means admitting the records exist, which means explaining what they say." Colin looked at me. He said, "You own this ship." I said, "I do." He said, "The data core is part of the ship." I said, "It is." He said, "So the records belong to the person who holds the ship." I understood what he was building toward. A private citizen, not a government, not a political entity, not a party with any established position in the existing diplomatic dispute. A salvage broker who had purchased an asset at a legitimate public auction and had discovered, in the course of assessing that asset, documentation of significant legal interest. The Varick Dominion could challenge a government filing through diplomatic channels and slow it for years. Challenging a private commercial salvage claim with attached documentation before the Trade Council's commercial division was a different proceeding entirely. It required them to appear before the Council's commercial board and explain, on the public record, why the documentation from a legitimately purchased vessel should be considered invalid, which meant explaining, in that formal setting, what the documentation actually documented. I said to Owen, across the common area where he was reviewing his calibration notes, "How long for the drives?" He looked up and said, 3 hours if I'm left to work." We left him to work. 2 hours and 55 minutes later, the drives engaged. The vibration moved through the deck and up through the walls, a low building hum that expanded into something that felt like the ship drawing a breath it had been holding for a long time. The lights on the command deck shifted from emergency setting to full operational brightness. Displays that had been dark for a decade came alive with system status information. The cruiser, which had been cold and still and waiting for 41 years, began to feel like a ship that was going somewhere. I filed the transit registration from the command deck. Owner and operator, Marcus Hale. Licensed salvage broker. Registry number on file. Vessel. Hull number on file. Former Varick Dominion military cruiser. Private salvage acquisition under certificate of purchase from Korath Station public auction. Destination. Galactic Trade Council Administrative Hub, Sector 3. Purpose of transit. Formal documentation submission, and associated legal proceedings. The registration processed without a flag. The Varick diplomatic office did not yet know what had been found aboard their former ship. The auction registry had not yet updated with any details beyond the sale completion. Nobody had told them. We had a window, and I intended to use it completely. Colin stood at the forward window on the command deck as the tether disengaged, and the cruiser moved clear of the anchor point and found its heading. The star field shifted as the ship came around, and he watched it move with an expression I did not try to analyze. After a while he said, "I have never been on a ship this large." I said, "You stopped noticing the size after a few days." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What made you open the containment door? Everyone else with information about that ship decided it wasn't worth the risk." I said, "They knew what was inside. I didn't. I only knew something was being kept alive in there, and I couldn't leave without understanding what." He said, 41 years. We get out because a salvage broker needed to understand what he'd bought." I said, "More or less." He looked at the stars for another moment, then he said, "Make sure you bill them for the door." I went back to the secondary command station and opened a new document. I titled it with the care you give something that is going to be read by a formal legal board and entered into a permanent record. The title was Invoice, Formal Notice of Claim, Biological Salvage Recovery, and Extended Storage, 17 Human Individuals, Varick Dominion, Accountable Party. Line 1. Purchase Price, Lot 7, Korath Station Public Salvage Auction, Certificate of Purchase attached, 400 credits. Line 2. Transit Fees, Docking Charges, Boarding Equipment and Materials, Atmosphere Analysis Consumables, Cipher Access Tools, Itemized List attached. Line 3. Emergency Medical Provisions and Revival Support for 17 individuals, itemized by unit and standard catalog rate, supply receipts attached. I reached line 4 and I took my time with it. I opened the Galactic Trade Registry's standard tariff schedule. It was publicly available and had been in regular use without significant revision for 20 years. I located the section governing living cargo, held in active biological suspension. The standard tariff rate was the rate charged per individual per year for the maintenance of living cargo in a suspended state, and it was a rate designed for cargo holds where passengers might spend weeks or months in transit. I took that rate. I multiplied it by 17. I multiplied that result by 41. And I added the fractional year adjustments using the rate change records in the public tariff archive. Because the rate had been adjusted 6 times over the 41-year period, and accuracy mattered. I ran the calculation twice. The number was the same both times. I added it to the document as line 4. At standard Galactic Trade Registry tariff for living cargo held in active biological suspension, 17 individuals, 41 years of continuous storage with annual rate adjustments, as documented in the public tariff archive. Total due from the Varick Dominion, as the party responsible for the original and continued detention of said cargo without authorization, registration, or disclosure. The number was approximately 280 times the annual operating budget of a mid-sized galactic trading company. I understood it was an extraordinary number. I was not expecting to collect it in full. That was not what the number was for. The number was a specific, formally calculated, publicly verifiable figure attached to what had been done. It was a number that required the Varick diplomatic office, in order to contest it, to appear before the Trade Council's commercial board and explain on the record what line 4 was referring to, what the 17 individuals were, how long they had been there, under what circumstances they had arrived, who had decided they would stay. 41 years of storage fees for cargo they had captured, never declared to any authority, never registered through any standard interspecies protocol, and never returned. I attached the complete data core archive, Grace's documentation chain, the original purchase certificate, the transit registration, the ship's life support operational logs showing 41 years of uninterrupted active function, the pod status records showing continuous biological activity across all 17 units throughout the full period. I addressed the document to the Varric diplomatic office, formal legal notice, response required within the Trade Council's standard 30-day commercial dispute window. I copied the Trade Council's commercial division. I copied the Trade Council's legal oversight board. I copied the Trade Council's Interspecies Welfare Commission. I sat with the distribution list for a moment and thought about the auctioneer walking into his back office and not coming back out. Then I added a final distribution line. I copied every independent news service registered with the Trade Council's Press Accreditation Office. 47 services, every size and reach and readership, all of them. I sent the document. From somewhere below on the crew deck, voices were carrying up through the ship, all 17 of them, overlapping, the sound of people finding out what they still had in common, and what had changed and what they needed to figure out next. Someone laughed, a real sudden laugh, the involuntary kind that comes when something is genuinely unexpected and funny, and it moved through the ship and reached the command deck clearly. I leaned back in the pilot chair and listened to them. The cruiser moved steadily forward. Outside the forward window, the stars held their position. I pulled up the Wren's accounting system and opened the expense report for the Korath station trip. I filed the 400 credits under operating costs. In the category field I typed, "Best money I ever spent." Then I opened a message to Claire. I attached the invoice. In the message body I wrote one line. I wrote, "You were right that it was not a reason to not buy it. It was the only reason to buy it." She replied in 4 minutes. Her message read, "Marcus Hale, you are the most infuriating person in this entire region of space, and I am personally going to submit a separate invoice to the Varric Dominion for the 3 days of worry you have cost me, and also, I already called the Trade Council press office before your document arrived, and they are already asking questions. And also, what is the number on line 4 because I need a moment?" I sent her the number. She replied in 2 minutes with one word. The word was, "Good." Below me on the crew deck, the voices continued. Gordon explaining heading options to someone. Owen telling another person the complete technical history of the drive calibration in more detail than they had probably requested. Alan moving between people with the quiet, focused attention of a medic who does not stop being a medic because the immediate crisis is over. Ruth Kane's voice carrying a question about what Korath Station was like, what the sector had changed to, practical questions about the present moment. The questions of someone who has decided that the present moment is where they are living now and has begun the work of understanding it. Victor Lowe's voice asking about transit times, about council procedure, about what the formal complaint process looked like in practice, taking notes by the sound of it. Not one of them waiting for someone to tell them it was all right to start. The Varric diplomatic office was going to receive the document within the hour, once the notification system processed the delivery confirmation. Someone at a desk somewhere was going to open it and read the title, and then read line 4, and then read the attached archive, and understand what they were looking at. And then a specific kind of very serious problem was going to land on a series of desks in a particular order, moving upward through the Varric Dominion's administrative structure with the steady, unavoidable momentum of a thing that has been delayed for 41 years and has now run out of time to be delayed further. The diplomatic office was going to call. When they did, I was going to answer very calmly and note that all inquiries regarding the invoice should be directed to Claire Ogden at Vega Station, who was handling the administrative component of the claim, and who was, as of approximately 4 minutes ago, already in contact with the Trade Council's press office, and therefore not in a position to make the situation quieter for anyone, even if she wanted to. I was going to note that the 30-day commercial dispute window had begun at the timestamp of confirmed delivery, and that all documentation had been transmitted to the relevant Trade Council boards as listed in the distribution section of the formal notice, and that additional supporting documentation was available upon request through the standard commercial discovery process. And then I was going to ask, in the same level voice, how they wanted to proceed. I was looking forward to that conversation. Outside the forward window, the stars held their positions, old and patient, and unchanged, and the cruiser moved through them, with all its systems running correctly, life support steady and warm in every compartment, exactly as it had been for 41 years. But not for the same reason anymore. The Varric Dominion had spent 4 decades hoping this problem would diminish on its own, that the ship would be maintained quietly, that the file would stay buried, that the diplomatic flag would sit in the secondary archive forever, under internal resolution pending, waiting for a directive that nobody would have to issue if everyone simply continued to do nothing. The problem had not diminished. It had sat in a sealed room at the end of a lower corridor, being kept alive with meticulous care by systems that had been built to do exactly that, waiting with the patience of something that did not know it was waiting, until a salvage broker with 400 credits and a complete inability to leave a question unanswered had opened a door. The resolution was now in progress. It was just not the resolution anyone at the Varric diplomatic office had been hoping for. I checked the ship's internal clock and calculated that the delivery notification would reach the Varric diplomatic office in approximately 58 minutes, assuming their communication relay at Sector 3 was running at standard speed, which it typically was. 58 minutes was enough time for me to do one more thing before the calls started. I went down to the crew deck. The common area had become something in the last 2 days. It was not organized the way a ship's common area normally organized itself, with assigned seating and quiet, careful navigation around each other's space. It was organized the way a group of people organize themselves when they have decided, without needing to say so out loud, that they are working on something together, and the space is the workspace. Victor had spread his documentation work across one of the long tables, and was reviewing it with Francis Abbott, who had been a legal clerk on the Aldrin Point, and had apparently immediately understood the value of what Victor had assembled. Gordon had a star chart pulled up on the wall display, and was walking Neil Avery through the route options and the transit times for each one. Sandra was at a secondary comm panel, doing something I couldn't see from the doorway. Colin was sitting with Ruth Kane at a smaller table near the viewport. He was not talking at her. He was sitting beside her while she talked, answering when she asked something, not filling the silences she needed. I stood in the doorway for a moment without going in. Owen came up behind me from the engineering corridor and nearly walked into me. He said, "Drives are holding steady. We're looking at standard transit time to Sector 3. He said it the way engineers say things about machines they have just fixed and are satisfied with, which is a specific kind of satisfied that has nothing performative in it. I said, "Good work on the restoration." He shrugged, which was not modesty, but was the gesture of someone who had done the work he knew how to do, and did not require additional comment on it. He said, "What happened to the ship that was supposed to be here instead of this one?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The Aldrin Point. The settlement colony. There should have been a ship that arrived there eventually when we didn't. Someone should have gone looking." I said, "The official record listed the Aldrin Point as lost with all hands in a different sector. The colony would have been assigned a replacement ship in time. They would have been informed that the original settlers were gone." He processed that. He said, "So the colony exists." I said, "Almost certainly." He said, "Without us." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's 41 years of a colony that developed without the people who were supposed to start it." I said, "That's correct." He thought about that in the particular way that engineers think about complicated things, which is quietly and without visible sign, until they have reached a conclusion. Then he said, "We should visit." I said, "I think that's probably going to happen." He nodded, satisfied, and went back toward engineering. I went into the common area. Francis looked up from Victor's documentation and said, "We've been reviewing the chain of custody for the data core records. The legal argument for admissibility in a Trade Council commercial proceeding is solid. Victor's cross-referencing makes the sequence impossible to dispute without disputing the Varric Dominion's own filing practices." I said, "Grace had the same conclusion." Francis said, "Grace is right. The question is going to be remedy. The commercial board can impose financial penalties. It cannot compel criminal proceedings against individuals. For that you need a separate petition to the Interspecies Justice Commission, and that process takes longer and requires a higher evidentiary threshold." I said, "What's the threshold?" She said, "We have it. The intent to conceal is documented in the administrative entries. The original captain's suppression of the rescue record is in their own files, cross-dated against the altered navigation record. The intent is not implied, it's explicit. I said, "How long does the Justice Commission process take?" She said, "The longest part is establishing standing. Who brings the petition, on what basis, and with what documentation? If the 17 of us file collectively as the direct injured parties, and if you file as the salvage operator who uncovered the documentation, and if the Trade Council's Interspecies Welfare Commission agrees to co-file based on the welfare implications, the standing question is answered before the petition is formally submitted." I said, "Can you draft the petition?" She said, without hesitation, "Yes." Victor looked up from his notes. He said, "I'll have the evidentiary index completed before we reach Sector 3. I went to find Grace, who was at one of the interface panels near the back of the common area, still working through the data core archive. I said, "How much more is there?" She said, "I've reviewed approximately 70% of the total archive. The remaining 30% is primarily research methodology notes and facility maintenance records. There may be additional administrative entries I haven't reached. I'm not stopping until I've read everything." I said, "What's the most significant thing you've found that wasn't in the files I initially reviewed?" She thought for a moment, then she said, "There is a communication log from Year 7 of the program. It is addressed from the vessel to the Varick Diplomatic Office. It is not a research note. It is a direct communication from the commanding officer of the holding vessel at that time, requesting a disposition directive. The response from the diplomatic office is in the same log." She paused. The response is a single line. It says, "Matter is under ongoing review. Maintain current status. No further communication on this subject." I said, "That's direct documented involvement from the diplomatic office." She said, 7 years in, which means the diplomatic office knew the situation in detail, requested no change, and then did not communicate on the subject again for the next 34 years. I said, "That changes the nature of the claim significantly." She said, "Yes." She looked at me steadily. "It means this was not the decision of one captain, who made a bad choice under pressure, and was then protected by institutional inertia. It was an active institutional decision, confirmed in writing, maintained deliberately for decades." I said, "Add it to Grace's documentation chain." She said, "It's already there." I left her to her work and went back to the command deck. The 58 minutes were almost up. I sat in the pilot chair and thought about the communication log from Year 7. One line from the diplomatic office. "Matter is under ongoing review. Maintain current status. No further communication on this subject. Maintain current status. No further communication." 41 years condensed into 11 words that had been sitting in the data core of a ship that nobody was supposed to buy. The notification alert on my terminal sounded at the timestamp I had calculated. Delivery confirmed. The document had been received at the Varick Diplomatic Office's registered communication address, logged at the Trade Council's intake system, and timestamped for the 30-day response window. I set the terminal to log all incoming calls and sat back. The first call came from an unregistered relay address 17 minutes after delivery confirmation. I did not answer unregistered calls. I let it route to the log. The second call came from a registered Varick Dominion administrative address 6 minutes after that. I let it route to the log also, not because I was avoiding the conversation, because I wanted to answer it on my terms, with Claire already briefed, and the press accreditation notices already processing, and with the Trade Council's commercial division already holding the time-stamped copy. I sent Claire a message telling her to expect contact from the Varick Diplomatic Office within the next few hours. I told her to acknowledge receipt, confirm the 30-day window, and refer all substantive questions to the documentation as filed. I told her the communication log from Year 7 was now attached to the evidentiary record as Exhibit 4, and that Francis Abbott, who had been the Aldrin Point's legal clerk and who was currently drafting a separate petition to the Interspecies Justice Commission, would be in contact with her shortly. Claire replied in 3 minutes. She said, "Exhibit 4 is extraordinary. I have already spoken with 2 of the press services and both are running the story before the end of the station day. The Trade Council's Welfare Commission contacted us before the diplomatic office did, which means they have someone watching the incoming filings. And Frances Abbott sounds like exactly the right person to have on this. And please tell her, I look forward to working with her. I showed the message to Frances, who read it and said, tell her I'll call her within the hour. I went back to the command deck and looked at the incoming call log. 3 more registered contacts from Varick Dominion administrative addresses, logged in the 17 minutes I had been below. I looked at the pattern of the calls, the escalating origin addresses, and understood what was happening. The document was moving up the administrative chain, and each level that received it was making the same calculation. This is not something I can handle, and so passing it up to the next level, which made the same calculation, until it reached a level where someone had the authority to pick up a communication link and try to talk to the person who had sent it. I picked up the 4th incoming call, which came from a registered Varick diplomatic address in the tier that indicated a senior official, and I answered it. The person on the other end was a Varick official whose name I noted, and whose title I noted, both of which were significant, and whose first words were that there appeared to have been an administrative error in the documentation of the vessel in question, and they wished to discuss a correction process. I said, I appreciate the call. All matters related to the formal claim should be directed to my business partner, Claire Ogden at Vega Station, whose contact information is in the distribution section of the notice as filed. For your reference, the 30-day commercial dispute window began at the timestamp of confirmed delivery earlier today. The documentation has been transmitted to all parties listed in the distribution section, including the Trade Council's Interspecies Welfare Commission, which I am told has already been in contact with my business partner. I paused for exactly 1 beat. Is there anything else I can help you with today? There was a silence on the line. Then the official said, in a more careful voice, that they would be in contact with my business partner. I said, she'll be expecting your call. I ended the connection and sat quietly for a moment. Below me on the crew deck, someone was cooking something. I could smell it through the ventilation. It was not a particularly impressive smell, the ship's food stores being what they were, but it was the smell of someone choosing to cook rather than simply eat, which was a different thing entirely, and said something about the state of mind below. Ruth Kane came up to the command deck about 20 minutes later. She stood at the forward window for a moment looking at the stars, and then she turned and said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Why did it cost 400 credits? If they wanted the ship to disappear, why not simply destroy it?" I had thought about this. I said, "Destroying a ship leaves a record. A detonation event, a debris field, radiation signatures, people notice. Disposing of it through a legitimate auction produced a paper trail that showed it was handled through a standard process, which made it look like a normal decommissioning, and at 400 credits, they expected it to sell fast to someone who wouldn't look closely." She said, "They expected an alien buyer." I said yes. She said, "And an alien buyer would have seen 17 human suspension pods in a biological containment bay, and done what? Scrapped the pods? Sold the contents?" I said, "I don't know. I think the most likely outcome they were planning for was that whoever bought the ship would see the containment warning and not open the door, would assume it was a hazardous materials situation, something chemical or biological in the containment sense, and would either avoid the bay entirely or vent it without looking." She said, "And we would have just stayed in there." I said, "That's what I think they were counting on." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You opened the door because you didn't know to be afraid of it." I said, "I opened it because I needed to understand what I had bought." She said, "That's the same thing." I thought about that. I said, "Maybe." She looked at the stars for another moment. Then she said, "When we get to the Trade Council, what happens?" I said, "The commercial claim goes in front of the commercial board. Frances's petition goes to the Justice Commission. The press services that Claire has already briefed are going to be running the story within hours if they haven't already. The Varick diplomatic office is going to spend the next 30 days trying to find a way to address this, without admitting publicly what the documentation shows. They will not find one, because the documentation is their own records." She said, "And us?" I said, "You are the injured parties in both proceedings. You have standing in both the commercial claim and the Justice Commission petition. What happens after the proceedings is a question with a lot of possible answers. Some of those answers include things like restitution, formal acknowledgement, and a public record that says clearly and permanently what happened to the Aldrin Point. She said, 41 years. I said, yes. She said, everyone we were going to the colony to meet. Everyone who came after us when we didn't arrive. I said, the colony exists. Owen asked about it earlier. Almost certainly it was built by the replacement settlers. 41 years of development without you, but it exists. She said, that's a strange thing to think about. I said, I imagine it is. She looked at the stars a while longer. Then she said, thank you for opening the door. I said, you're welcome. She went back downstairs, and I heard her voice join the others, and the smell of the cooking got slightly stronger through the vents, and the cruiser moved steadily forward through the star field with all its systems running correctly. My terminal showed 2 more incoming calls from Varric diplomatic addresses, both logged without answer, and a message from Claire saying that the first press story had published and was already being picked up across 17 secondary services, and that the Trade Council's commercial division had sent a formal acknowledgement of receipt of the documentation and had flagged the claim for expedited review given the interspecies welfare implications. Expedited review. That was faster than I had expected. I thought about the auctioneer at Korath Station, standing at his counter with the purchase certificate in the printer, keeping his eyes carefully to the left of where they naturally wanted to go. I thought about the Draenei bidders panel sitting face down on an empty chair. I thought about every alien trader in that room who had seen Lot 7 appear on the screen, and had made the calculation that whatever was on that ship was not worth the implications of knowing about it. They had been right, in their way. It had not been worth it, for them. But I was human, and the thing about being human, the thing that 31 years of Varric research notes had observed and documented, and still managed to not quite understand, was that we did not approach a sealed door and think about whether it was worth the implications of knowing what was behind it. We just needed to know. The cruiser moved through the stars, and somewhere behind us at Korath Station, the auction house was running its next block, and the secondary archive of the Galactic Trade Registry still had a hull number flagged as internal resolution pending, but the notation was going to be updated within the next few days, because the resolution was no longer pending. It was done. 41 years of waiting, and then a door, and then a salvage broker's 400 credits, and then 17 people awake and working, and already building the next thing. I leaned back in the pilot chair, and the stars held their positions outside the window, and I let the incoming call log continue to fill. Claire was handling it. Francis was drafting the petition. Victor and Grace had the documentation complete. And below me on the crew deck, 17 people who had been lost for 41 years were figuring out what came next, which was what they had always done, and what they would always do, and what no sealed door and no incomplete manifest, and no internal resolution pending had ever actually stopped. I reached into my coat and checked that the 3rd storage drive was still there. It was. I left it there and watched the stars, and waited for whatever came next with the specific calm of a person who has opened a door that needed opening, and is not, in any part of himself, sorry that he did. The settlement colony had a name, Harrow's Reach. I found it in the transit records when I was pulling the route documentation for our journey to Sector 3. Because the colony's star system sat on one of the secondary transit corridors we would pass within range of. Victor found it at the same time I did, from his work on the documentation index. He mentioned it during what had become the informal evening gathering in the common area, where most of the 17 had developed the habit of assembling after the day's work was done. Not by arrangement. Nobody had suggested it. It had simply started happening the second evening after all the revivals were complete, and it had continued. Victor said the name quietly, and the common area went quiet around it in a specific way. The way that rooms go quiet when a piece of information arrives that requires a moment of adjustment before anyone knows what to do with it. Colin said, Harrow's Reach. Victor said, the replacement settlers arrived 2 years after the Aldrin Point's listed loss. They named it after the survey officer who had mapped the system originally. Harrow was his name. He was supposed to be on our ship but missed the departure. Grace said, is there population data? Victor said, From the public transit registry, yes. Current registered population is approximately 38,000. 38,000 people living in a colony that had been built on the assumption that the Aldrin Point's passengers were dead. 38,000 people who had no particular knowledge that 17 of the intended original settlers were alive and on their way to a trade council proceeding. Petra Dale said, from her seat near the viewport, "We should contact them." She had been the Aldrin Point's agricultural specialist, and she had spent most of the past 2 days in quiet conversation with people, rather than in the data core, which I had noticed was its own kind of work. She said, "Not officially. Not through a trade council communication. Just a message, so they know before they read it in a press service." There was a general sound of agreement around the common area, the kind that does not require individual voices because it is unanimous. Colin looked at me. I said, "I can route a private communication through the Wren's relay. It won't be traceable to the cruiser's ident before we file the formal notification at Sector 3. He said, "Who writes it?" Nobody answered immediately. Then Diane Weller, who had been quiet for most of the gathering, said, "We all do. 1 line each. Just our names and that we're alive and where we're going. That's enough for a first message." That was what they did. I routed the transmission through the Wren's relay and addressed it to the Harrows Reach Colonial Administrative Office, with a header that identified it as a personal communication of historical significance, not an official proceeding. 17 lines. 17 names. 1 sentence. "We are alive and in transit to the Galactic Trade Council at Sector 3, and we will be in contact once the formal proceedings are complete." The message went out, and there was no way to know when it would arrive, or what would happen when it did, and the common area sat with that for a while. Then Owen said, from the doorway where he had appeared holding a cup of something he had apparently found in the ship's stores that was at least approximately tea, "The drives are running at 97% efficiency, which is better than this ship has probably run in the last decade." The common area received this with the warmth that practical information delivered at the right moment always received, and the conversation shifted, and I sat in a corner and listened to it shift, and thought about 17 lines in a private transmission, traveling through the relay toward a colony that had been built without them. The rest of the journey to Sector 3 took 4 days at standard transit. They were not quiet days. Frances completed the petition to the Interspecies Justice Commission and sent it to Claire, who reviewed it with a legal contact she had on retainer and reported back that it was, in her contact's assessment, one of the most comprehensively documented petitions she had seen in 20 years of practice. Claire had also, in the interval, been contacted by 2 additional press services, a historian who specialized in Varick Dominion policy, and the Trade Council's Interspecies Welfare Commission's senior investigator, who had opened a parallel inquiry on the Commission's own initiative, based on the documentation already in their possession. The Varick Diplomatic Office had communicated with Claire 4 times. All 4 communications had been requests to discuss an administrative correction to the documentation. All 4 had received the same response. All matters related to the formal claim should be addressed through the Trade Council's standard commercial dispute process within the 30-day window. Claire had phrased this with impeccable professionalism and complete immovability, and I had rarely admired her more. Victor completed the evidentiary index. It was 47 pages. It was cross-referenced against every document in the archive with a precision that I recognized, after a few days of watching Victor work, as the characteristic output of a man who had spent his professional life mapping things that needed to be mapped completely and correctly, and who had simply applied that discipline to a different kind of terrain. Grace finished reading the complete Data Core archive on the 3rd day. She found 3 additional administrative entries that had not been in the sections I had initially reviewed. One was a cost analysis from year 18 of the program, calculating the ongoing expense of maintaining the holding vessel and comparing it against the value of the research being produced. The analysis concluded that the research value continued to justify the expense. Another was a personnel rotation record, showing which researchers had been assigned to the program over the years and when. The third was an internal memo from year 29, unsigned, recommending that the program be concluded and the subjects transferred to a long-term holding facility elsewhere in the Dominion's territory. The memo had been written and filed and had received no response. Grace added all 3 to the documentation chain and sent the updated version to Frances and Victor and Claire and to me. On the evening of the third day, Gordon Reese stood at the forward window on the command deck and watched the star field and said, without turning around, "Do you know what the hardest part is?" I was at the secondary station reviewing the Trade Council's procedural calendar. I said, "Tell me." He said, "I keep trying to remember what I was thinking about on the Aldrin Point before the inspection stop. What I was planning to do when we arrived at the colony. I remember the work plans in general terms. I don't remember the specific things, the day-to-day things, what I was going to do the first week." I said, "That's 41 years of distance." He said, "Yes, but it's also that none of it happened. I was planning for something that never occurred, and it's strange to try to remember planning for a future that didn't come." I said, "The future you're in now is the one you're planning for." He considered that. He said, "I know. It just takes some adjustment to point in the right direction." He turned from the window. "The navigation systems on this ship are in better condition than anything I worked with on the Aldrin Point." I said, "The Varric engineers built well." He said, "They did." He said it without additional comment, the way you acknowledge a fact that carries complexity in it, and is still a fact. On the fourth day, as Sector 3 came into the navigation range and the Trade Council's communication beacons began to register on the array, we received a response from Harrow's Reach. It came through the Wren's relay return channel, addressed to the private communication we had sent, and it was long. Much longer than 17 lines. I routed it to the common area display and they read it together, all 17 of them. And I stood in the doorway and did not read it with them because it was not for me. I heard the room while they read it, the shifts of breath and the particular silence that comes when a piece of text requires more space than the room feels like it has. After a while, Colin said something I could not make out fully. After a while longer, Ruth said something in response, and several voices overlapped her, and then the room was not quiet anymore. I went back to the command deck and prepared the formal docking registration for the Trade Council Administrative Hub at Sector 3. The docking registration went through without complications. The Trade Council's intake office confirmed receipt and assigned us a berth, and forwarded the registration details to the Commercial Division and the Welfare Commission, and Francis's petition to the Justice Commission was transmitted formally from the cruiser's communication array as we entered the docking approach. The date and time were logged. The proceedings were open. I docked the cruiser at the assigned berth and filed the final transit documentation, and sat in the pilot chair for a minute, while the docking collar pressurized. 11 years of salvage work. I had bought broken freighters and stripped platforms and decommissioned escort ships. I had made reasonable profits and absorbed reasonable losses, and kept the Wren flying and kept Claire employed, and kept the business operating through situations that were not always clean or simple. I had never bought anything for 400 credits that had turned out to be this. I got up from the pilot chair and went down to the crew deck, where 17 people were gathering their things and preparing to walk off the ship, and I went with them to the boarding collar, and when the hatch opened and they walked out into the Trade Council's docking corridor, I walked out with them. The corridor was busy with the standard traffic of a major administrative hub. Staff and officials and traders and representatives of a dozen species moving through the wide, well-lit passage on their various purposes. Nobody knew yet, in this corridor, what the ship that had just docked was or who had just walked off it. That would change within a few hours when the press services finished processing what Claire had sent them. Colin stopped at the edge of the docking apron and looked up and down the corridor. Then he said, quietly, "It's loud." I said, "You'll get used to it." He said, "Yes, we will." He walked forward into the corridor, and the others followed, and I followed them. And the cruiser sat in its berth behind us with all its systems running correctly, life support still ticking over, steady and patient, because that was what it had been built to do, and it did not know to stop. The Varric diplomatic office sent 3 more communications to Claire's address during the docking procedures. All 3 received the same response. The 30-day window was running. The documentation was filed. The proceedings were open. I checked my terminal as we walked, and saw that the first press story had now been picked up by 61 secondary services across 6 sectors. The historian who had contacted Claire had already published an initial analysis that was, by Claire's description, thorough and accurate, and not particularly gentle toward the Varric Dominion's administrative decisions over the relevant 41-year period. I put the terminal away. The corridor ahead was busy and loud, and full of the ordinary motion of a place where a great deal of business was conducted every day, and 17 people who had been asleep for 41 years were walking into it, and none of them were waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. The resolution was open. It would take the time it took. And I had a salvage business to run, and the Wren needed a few maintenance items I had been putting off, and Claire was going to have a great deal of administrative work in the coming weeks, and would require my actual attention and cooperation, rather than my habit of calling her after the fact. But first I was going to find somewhere in this station that served decent coffee, and I was going to drink it, and I was going to call Claire, and I was going to let her say everything she wanted to say about the last 4 days without interrupting her even once. She had earned that. And when she was done, I was going to say, simply and without preamble, I found what was on the ship. She already knew. She was going to say she already knew. And I was going to say, I know you knew. And here is what I think we do next. And we were going to figure it out together, the way we always did, which was not always graceful or predictable, but was always, in the end, sufficient. The corridor was busy and loud, and the stars were outside, and the cruiser was in its berth, and the proceedings were open. I kept walking.